and most of today's class will be about different peoples of how they opened up their talk about the Megillah, because in knowing how they open up, seeing how they open up the talk in the Megillah is telling about how they viewed the story of Purim. So let's open up here. Okay. Hold on, let's get everyone on. Okay, so we're holding the middle of page, loading towards the bottom. Hey, Bruce, loading towards the bottom of page 10b. Again, with different various students of the Talmud, meaning the different Amoraim and Tanoim, how they would view the story of Purim. You have to remember the story of Purim was obviously prior to the story of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was at the end of or after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Purim story was in between the first and second temple, so it's a good 400 or 500 years from the time of the Mishnah and then the Talmud and the story of Purim. So Rabbi Shua ben Levi was one of the last of the Tanoim of the Mishnah era, kind of entering into the Talmudic era. He was a kind of what's called in between. He was a student of Rebbe, or a student of the son of the Rebbe. So he says like this: Rabbi Shua ben Levi Pesach la Pischa lahai parashasa mihacha. So how would Rabbi Shua ben Levi open up his discussions of talking about the story of Esther? He quoted a verse as follows. Now again, different verses, different ways that the rabbis open are going to either show the dire situation the Jewish people were in before Purim, so to say, what happened, what led to the story of Purim, or kind of showing on, alluding towards to the miracle. And even in the verses themselves, the different rabbis themselves, the commentaries, how the commentaries understand the statements of these rabbis is how they interpret it. Some will interpret the story as being a verse that they quote as a sign of negativity, and others a sign of positivity. So here you have an example of this. It says, when it talks about the curses, this is in the curses of Devarim that we're going to read in a few weeks, that it says that just exactly how, and it shall come to pass that the Lord, that as the Lord rejoices over you to do you good, Kain Yosis Lahara Eschem, so the Lord will rejoice over to cause you perish, which is bad. So something that just like God is enthusiastic to do good for the Jewish people, God sometimes could be enthusiastic to do bad for the Jewish people. That's something that the verse is talking about. So the Gemara continues. Again, this is the question: who is this referring to? Is God? Does the Holy One, blessed be He, take joy, so to say, or rejoice in the falling of the wicked? Now, the wicked in this case could be in the initial thought of punishing the Jews, calling them wicked, or eventually punishing and those who get punished with the story of Purim. It's brought down in Divrei Hayamim that when the soldiers, I think of Yehoshaphat, went to fight against the various nations, so before the armies, they said, Hoidul Hashem, praise be the Lord, for L'olam Chazdei, His kindness is forever, but doesn't say Ki Tov. Everyone knows the verse goes, Hodel Hashem Ki Tov, Ki L'olam Chazdei. But they omitted the words Ki Tov for He's good, because it's not good. It's not good, even if it's not good, even if we're going to be praised for God's kindness, but to say that it's good that the enemies are going to die because these armies of Yehoshaphat are going to kill the enemies, we don't say it's good. So we see that God doesn't take joy in the negativity and the wicked, in the falling of the wicked. Rabbi Yochanan teaches, why did we omit the words Ki Tov, for it is good? So he says, when we thank God for the success of the armies, because that's the whole point. God's not happy in the befalling of the negativity on the wicked. And this really, we're going to see how this applies even to real wicked people. We're not talking about Jewish people who've sinned, who God wants them to repent. We're talking about people that God that have done horrible things, like the Egyptians, etc. So he says, Rashi says, B'tzeis lifnei hachalutz. What is this referring to? When they went out to chalutz is usually an expression. What does he say? What does he translate? The army. So what's this talking about? Yehoshaphat. It's talking about the king of Judah, Yehoshaphat, king of David. It says, B'divrei Yam Kshiyatzul hilachem al ha'amonim v'agivayim. Who did he fight against? They were fighting against Amonim. These were enemies of the Jewish people. Shabbalov, and not only that, he didn't go and initiate the war. They came to start up with the Jewish people. When these people came to start up with the Jewish people, they went out to war. They were victorious, but they didn't say kitov. They said Hodu Hashem kilal chaz. But to say good, Hodu Hashem kitov mashma tov she calls lefanav azos. If you can add the kitov, it's something that's praiseworthy. And God says, I don't want to say it's tov. It's a good thing that that enemies fall. So even for the most dire people, even an enemy who goes against the Jews, initiates them in war, we don't say kitov. So how could he say that we put this verse as just as God took joy to do you good, he's going to take joy to do you bad? How is it possible? Which would if you're going to apply this to Haman, to the story of the Jewish people in the decree of Haman before the salvation, means that the Jewish people, of course, as we're going to discuss later in the Talmud, what was the punishment for? What did they do so wrong in the story of Haman that the decree was initiated? So he continues. The Gemara says, there's a famous Rabbi Yochanan, a famous idea that's brought down. It says when the Egyptians and the Jewish Bnei Israel camped together by the Red Sea on the seventh day on Shvi Shal Pesach, and it says the two camps are separated. They didn't go at each other that whole night. And at that night, when we're getting ready for the splitting of the Red Sea, and including in the splitting of the Red Sea, of course, was the final destruction of Egypt. Big Shumal Cheshar Slam Mashiv. The angels wanted to say praise. They wanted to sing praise to God. They wanted to sing praise for the destruction of Egypt. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God says to the angels, my handiwork is sinking in the sea. And you want to say Shira, you want to sing? You want to sing that this is the way, that this is something song-worthy? Now, we know it's like they say, you can never get it right. When the Jewish people said Shira, they were there was a bit of a disappointment. Why did you wait so long to say Shira? So there's a difference between the Shira that the Jewish people have, and the Jewish people did say Shira. Afterwards, we have the Oz Yashar Moshe. There's a difference between the Shira of salvation, and the Shira of destruction. So the angels wanted to sing for the destruction of Egypt. The Jews primarily were singing for the miracles that happened, for saving them. And what's interesting is again, the Jewish people were kind of admonished for waiting so long, waiting 7 days to say Shira. So that we have a question. So how could we quote the pasuk and saying that this is how you open up the statement to the story of Megillah? Kasher sas Hashem aleichem ha'etiv eschem ken yasis lahara eschem. He's going to be happy. Yasis is joyful in the destruction. So Rabbi Elazar says no. Hu einei sas. He himself is not joyful. Avacher mesis. Others are going to take joy in the fall of the Jewish people. God himself doesn't take joy, but the situation is going to cause joy. Now, this answer is kind of challenging because the question is why. What's the idea of this? But he continues. We also have, if we wanted to be medayik in the Hebrew, in the terminology used, Kein Yosis Lechsiv. Yasis Shema Mina Dakanami Dechsiv Kain Yasis Velechsiv Yasus. Yasus would be a better terminology for God to be happy. Yasis is also could be, as most of the commentaries say, Yasis, even though we have Yasis of Ayah Lekayach, we do have times where it says that God is happy, but the word Yasis could be both ways. Yasus would be only that God takes joy. So the fact that it could also mean that others take joy, Shema Mina, that we're not talking about God's joy, but the joy that others in the grammar. And when God decided to decree, and then it came about the story of Haman, so the enemies of the Jewish people were happy. So let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz first, and I want to just give a little insight into Rabbi Shua ben Levi's theory here. So it says the verb yasis can be interstrive or kazativ, meaning that it can be translated either as he will rejoice or he will cause others to rejoice. However, yasus is always that God will rejoice, and therefore always implies that latter. For this reason, the Gemara uses the word yasus to indicate how yasis should be understood, sometimes in the positive, sometimes referring to God, sometimes referring to others. Okay, so this finishes Rabbi Shua ben Levi's opening statement that basically there's a joy for God that he causes, say at the end, what we understand is God causes others to rejoice in what's going to befall the Jewish people. Now, the reason is why. Is that just God punishing the Jewish people, or everything that God does? Like the Alter Rebbe brings down in Tanya, that God is like a Avarachman. We're finishing the month of Av. Av means a father of compassion. What father of compassion, even if there's a need for discipline of the children, would take joy in someone taking, or would cause others to take joy in hurting their children? That would be ridiculous, right? Even if you think your children need discipline, first of all, you wouldn't have anyone else discipline them. And second of all, even if you needed others to discipline them, they had it, but you wouldn't want them to be joyful in punishing your children. That's another story. What's that have to do with anything? So some of the commentaries come to answer that the idea is that hastens the punishment of enemies. The God doesn't like to see people be happy in other people's negativity. When you're happy in someone else's negativity, it doesn't excite God, and therefore God causes the enemies of the Jewish people to be happy in hurting the Jewish people, because by doing so, it triggers in God a reaction to protect his children, and either, like in the story of Haman, not to end up letting them do what they want to do. So, if they would just be, faithful servants of God, if Haman was coming and saying, "Okay, God, I'm here for you. You want me to punish your children? I'll punish them for them." So maybe we would be in a worse situation. But the very fact that they took personal joy in hurting the Jewish people or planning against the Jewish people, so that kind of triggered in God a reaction where he says, "No, I'm not going to allow this. I'm going to save the Jewish people." I just want to see others, and remember, there's other commentaries here. It's interesting. This is an interesting. I think it's who brings this down. That it's brought down like this. It says at the end, the Iyayam. The Iyayam says, it's commentary. He says, if you're talking about the joy of the Jewish people, what's the difference between Haman and Achashverosh? Why was Haman eventually punished for taking personal joy in hurting the Jewish people? And why was Achashverosh not? I mean, Achashverosh was just as happy initially in the story. He's no great player in the story of the Jewish people. He knows how to get out of it. He's a wishy-washy fellow. But how is it that he doesn't get punished? So actually, the Iyayam answers that there's a difference between Haman's joy and Achashverosh's joy. Achashverosh was a politician, and it was about the money and the politics. Haman sold him the political benefit Achashverosh would have, right? We could apply it to what's going on today, right? So Achashverosh was sold on the political benefit he would have as a king and a monarch on the falling of the Jewish people. He's giving him money. He's paying him a tremendous amount of silver. Yeshna Amachad, let's uproot the Jewish people. Achashverosh was looking at this primarily, I'm not going to say totally, but primarily on a political benefit. And therefore, when Esther was winning, he was okay with going with Esther, because Achashverosh was selfish. So Achashverosh was all about what he gains and what's in it for me. So when Haman sold the story, what's in it for him, he's like the guy who's one advisor says to do this and one advisor says that. It's all about bloating your own ego. So Achashverosh was what's good for him, but he wasn't personally joyful if the Jewish people get hurt. He didn't care either way. He wanted to know what benefits him. Haman, it says, he walked out. Haman yotze sameach v'toiv lev. It says Haman walked out happy. He was happy to hurt the Jewish people. He's one of these anti-Semites that you open up today the internet, who their whole agenda is not about anything else but to hurt the Jewish people, to talk negative, any conspiracy that you think of in the world, from the fires of Washington State to the migrants running across some part of northern Morocco. It's the Jewish people are involved. Haman was partially an anti-Semite. Sameach v'toiv lev. He paid money to hurt the Jewish people, and even though maybe eventually he would get benefit from it. But Pashut was happy for the befalling the Jewish people, therefore he's punished. Whereas Achashverosh was just a political hog and wanted what's best for him. If Esther is in charge and Esther's the one who's winning and Mordecai's winning, he's ready to back their cause as well. So it's brought down others that There's another idea that's brought down, that why does God elevate the enemies of the Jewish people to become heads of state? Because it's brought down, this is a Litvish of art, but it's brought down that Leiv Melachim B'Yad Hashem, Leiv Melachim V'Sarim B'Yad Hashem, that the heart of kings and ministers are in the hands of God, meaning everyone is in the hands of God, but there's less bechira, right? When you open up the news and you don't understand what's the policy here, why does it keep on changing? Is because it's Leiv Melachim V'Sarim B'Yad Hashem. God totally controls the hearts of the kings and the ministers, where there's not even a level of freedom. It's totally a dictator. God dictates how he wants it to be. So if the Jewish people would fall under the enemies of the Jewish people that were not kings and ministers, then they would have more bechira to hurt the Jewish people. Because God totally dictates the hearts of the kings and the sarim, therefore there's less of a chance where God could, so to say, it's easier to get out of a situation. It's a litfish of art, is it? Reb Chaim Volozhin, I think, says this word. Okay, let's go further. Rabbi Yochanan, okay. So one more he says over here. Yes, he brings down that the Chassam Sofer is the one who says that okay, there's just want to bring the positive view. There's two views over here. The general view of Rabbi Shua ben Levi is talking about the negativity that he opened up the story of Purim about negative, that God was happy, either he was happy or caused others to be happy in what befalls the Jewish people. So the two things, I think the Chassam Sofer says that one of the things is that when God caused them to be happy, he helped the Jewish people. Like it says, "Bin levecha al tismach," it says, when your enemy falls, don't take joy. So the fact that Haman and especially Haman and maybe Achashverosh were taking joy in hurting the Jewish people, that again triggers to God that there should be a switch, and he should help the Jewish people. Also, deeper, it's brought down that I think the Pnei Yeshua says that, or the Yaris Dvash says, that's known famous story about Rabbi Akiva, that when Rabbi Akiva saw the strength of Rome, he laughed and the other Chachamim cried. Why did he laugh? Because if those who go against God's will, they're able to be so happy, right? They heard the big parties of Rome, and they cried, "Why does Rome get a party?" And they destroy the temple. So if you see how Rome parties, surely what's going to be in store for the Jewish people. So too over here, the positive of this whole thing is kasher sos, that God gives joy to the enemies of the Jewish people, to give hope to the Jewish people, to know that even the if God's letting Haman be happy, imagine what's in store for you and what happened to Purim. Purim becomes the happiest day for the Jewish people's calendar. So that's a positive twist on what Rabbi Shua ben Levi says. Let's continue. Rabbi Abba bar Kana pasach lai pischal hai b'shasa. How did Rabbi Abba, the son of Kana, start off the Megillah? Adam shetayv lefanov nasan chachma v'das v'simcha. For the person who's good, God gives understanding and wisdom and joy. And that's referring to Mordechai Tzaddik. Mordechai Tzaddik was a person that stove, so eventually he got out of it, and we had a day of joy, which is Purim. But for the sinner, which is referring to Haman, Nasan inyan le'esai v'lichnois. He gives him the task of gathering and heaping up. And this is Haman. Lasis l'toiv l'fnei alikim, to give good for before God. This is Mordechai and Esther, like it says, Vatasim Esther's Mordechai Abeis Haman, that the giving good is to give Mordechai Haman's house. So the commentaries say that what's the idea of Haman gathering? What's Rabbi Steinsaltz say over here? Doesn't explain what it means, but the commentaries say that what is the idea of the gathering? The gathering is, I think it's Marsha who says that. The Marsha says that there's an idea that the tzaddikim are not running after riches. It says that a lot of the riches that happened when the Jewish people came to Eretz Yisrael was the people of Amori were hiding gold and silver in their house, and then if there was going to be tzaras on the house, they broke the walls and they found the diamonds and the gold. So God sometimes makes it, and this kind of answers a little bit for those who were listening to the story of Matei Shabbos, of Yosef Makir Shabbos, of the person who put all his wealth to protect his money in the stone, and it falls in the fish, and God gives it to Yosef Makir Shabbos, which is the story in Shabbos, that did Yosef, which was very loving for Shabbos, he gets the gold, but he didn't work for it. He found the diamond in the belly of the fish. So too Haman, God made him le'esay v'lichnois, that he should gather all his wealth. And then, like this, Mordechai doesn't have to go out there and gather it. Mordechai just gets everything from Haman, gets handed to him. So Haman thinks he's gathering all this wealth, so he should be a wealthy person, and doesn't realize that all the wealth that he's gathering is later to be transferred to Mordechai. In the days of Mashiach, it's going to be similar to that. When all the wealth of the world is going to be for those who do Hashem's will, and the times of the Beis Hamikdash, ish tachas kafne, ish tachas te'inasek. So that's another idea. Okay. So he says, there's one more question. This is a famous Purim Shaila. The Purim Shaila is like this. The people ask on Purim, how is it that Haman's house went to Mordechai? We know one of the laws of the destruction of the nation of Amalek, and Haman was clearly from a descendant of Amalek. He was a descendant from Agag, the king that was spared for a few hours by Saul, who impregnated some women and whatever, and he was able. The seed of Amalek continued, and therefore Amalek is not destroyed. Shaul did not kill Amalek as God wanted, as we know in the interaction between Samuel the prophet and Shaul. So, but the law is you're not allowed to take any of the spoils. One of the sins of Saul was they took from the spoils of Amalek, right? And God tells Shmuel, tells Shaul through Shmuel, does God want the zevachim? Does he want your sacrifices? He wants you to listen. And what listening is to destroy everything of Amalek. So how could Mordechai take Haman's home? Haman is Amalek. How could he take the spoils of Amalek? So therefore it says in the Megillah, if people are careful in the language, that it says that Achashverosh gave. Achashverosh the line is, it says, Bayemahu nasan hamelech Achashverosh eispeis Haman la'Esther. That Achashverosh gives the house of Haman and the property of Haman to Esther, and then Esther gives it to Mordechai. So what happens when Achashverosh takes ownership? And it's like we learn in Devarim, in the beginning, when it talks about the Jewish people going through the lands. How did they take the lands from Ammon? Because it was cleansed by Sichel. Once there's a new ownership, once Achashverosh takes ownership, everything that happens, the law is that everything that the enemy of the king, the property belongs to the king. He takes ownership. Achashverosh takes ownership. Now it's Achashverosh's home, and he's entitled to give it to whoever he wants to. He gives it to Esther, gives it to Mordechai. So it's called a cleansing. Achashverosh cleansed the property of Haman. It's no longer Achashverosh was not from Amalek; he was a Persian. So he claims he cleanses the property of Amalek and gives it to Mordechai. Okay, here we have an interesting Gemara because it's an interesting Tosfos that seems to be nothing to do with what we're talking about. It says Rabba ben Ofroin. I'm not a seasoned Talmudist, but I never really came across this name. It seems like Tosfos also did. So Rabba, the son of Ofron, he opens up when he talks about the Megillah from this. Again, what we see is that the verses that they quote seem just to be a verse, and it's not. They're telling a bit about the story of how they viewed the story and who were the heroes of the story and what were the points of importance of the story. Is how they applied these verses. So it says v'samti kisi be'elam v'ha'avditi misham melech v'sarim. So it says that, and I shall set my throne in Elam and destroy from there the kings and princes, says the Lord. This is in Yirmiyahu. Melech zu Vashti. Melech is Vashti because, as we said before, that Vashti, Elam is a reference to Shushan. So, and what is it referring to? I'm going to destroy the kings and the ministers. The kings is Vashti because Achashverosh is not destroyed. So it's referring to Vashti, who was a direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to see later in the Gemara or in the commentaries of the Gemara how Vashti tormented her husband Achashverosh. Achashverosh is not clear if he was totally a layman who became king, or he was also the son of Dariavush, of Darius, or forget the name, they will see in a second. But he wasn't the one who was meant to be king. He was the second son. He wasn't the son that was supposed to be king. So he kind of muscled his way into becoming king. Either way, Vashti is to refer to him as my grandfather's stall, the one who took care of the stalls of the horses. The one who takes care of the horses, he's going to tell me what to do. So Vashti was very degrading to her husband, and it led to her, of course, to her death. Achashverosh's patience went so far until he killed her. So Achashverosh's Melech is Vashti, and Sarim, the ministers, refers to Haman and his 10 sons. Of course, they were ministers of the king. They were all killed in the story of Haman. So again, he's focusing on the destruction of Haman and his gang. So Shushan is in, I guess, the province of Elam, and Elam is where the story of Purim happens. Like, if you remember, we learned at the beginning that Shushan was not the primary place of the kings. Shushan was the place of the summer house of the king. I think it's more south of what's today modern day Iran, of Persia. So what I just want to say, I just want to go back on one thing. It's a nice thing to know. This idea that you're not allowed to take from Amalek, which we said before, and that's why the properties had to be transferred to Achashverosh first. So we know that in the Megillah, at the end of the Megillah, when it describes the fight, the war that the Jewish people had against their enemies, it says they didn't touch any of the spoils that were entitled to them in this battle against the enemies of the Jews. Why? Because it's brought down according to certain commentaries, that all the 70, I think, 75,000 people that were killed by the Jews in the story of Esther, they were all descendants of Amalek. And because they were descendants of Amalek, you're not, like I said, you're not allowed to take from the spoils of Amalek. So therefore, they didn't touch the spoils of Amalek, and they let it go to the treasure of the king. Okay, so here Tosfos says an amazing Tosfos. Why is it amazing Tosfos? Because Tosfos goes on a side point. What is the name of the person who just said this last statement? His name is Rabba, the son of Ophra. So Tosfos tells us, Rabba by Ephron, Garsina, V'loi Garsina, and Ephron. His name couldn't be Ephron. His name had to be Ophron. Why couldn't it be Ephron? What's the difference? I guess there was different opinions of maybe his name was Ephron. The Shem Misharm Yirkov V'loi Mosku B'Shmayu. Because Ephron, who's Ephron? Ephron was the one who tried to who negotiated with Avram this crazy price of 400 coins, even though initially he says, I'll give it to you for free. But what do we see from here? Tosfos says Ephron was a Rasha. And therefore, if Ephron was a Rasha, the Shem Yirkov, you have to destroy, let the names of the wicked spoil, rot. You don't name your child after a wicked person. There's no way someone would name his child Ephron, because Ephron is Ephron the Rasha, the one who oversold or overcharged Avram a tremendous amount of money. Ephron is not considered a kind person. Rashi says about Ephron loses at one point. It could be I'm freezing up a second here. All right, I think I'm back. So Ephron loses a vav in his name because the vav is an indication of giving, tzedakah, and he loses that because Ephron was a greedy person. So Tosfos says not only was he a greedy person, but it's not possible anyone would name their son Ephron. Shem Risham Yirkov. It's interesting. You have crazy names today. I was once in. This is. We're learning that the Gemara of Rabbi Steinsaltz is translation. So I remember a story of Rabbi Steinsaltz. I was there in synagogue, and someone came in and she introduced herself. A woman came in, or a young woman came in. I think she was about to get married. So she introduced herself as Anatalia, and Anatalia, I think her name was. Anatalia was a very wicked queen, or she ruled in the house of David. She was from this house of Achav. She was from this northern kingdom. Her mother was Isabel, and we all know Isabel was a horrible queen, and Achav was a horrible king, and they made a shidduch with the southern kingdom of the house of David to try to unify the two kingdoms. At the end, she ends up really destroying almost. She tries to kill every descendant, her own children and grandchildren. She kills every descendant of the house of David, spare one, and that was Yehoash, I think, who was the king after her. But for 5 or 7 years, she ruled over the house of David, a very wicked woman. So Rabbi Steinsaltz says, I can't understand, why would your parents ever name you that? She was not a woman you would want to be named after. But here we see that he has a makar for that. Tosfos says, we don't name after Rishayim. Shem Rishayim Yirkov. Question is why certain other names that we have in Judaism that were named after not our best friends, for instance, Yishmael. All right. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak Psachla Pischalai Parasha. We could say Yishmael himself did tshuva at the end of his life. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak Psachla La Psicha La Parshas Mihacha. Reb Steinsaltz, Reb Dimi bar Yitzchak would start from here. Let's go to the next page. Okay, so it says in Ezra, it says like this. It says, we are servants, but in our slavery we didn't leave our God. And the king of Persia had chesed, had kindness towards us, because then you have to remember Ezra was the one that was a minister or a relationship with Esther's descendants, with Daryavish, and they rebuilt the second temple. But where does the chesed? He says Bisman Haman, in the story of Haman, when things turned. So he quoted that even though basically we're servants, right? Akati Avde Dachashverishanan, right? Everyone asks, well, why don't we say Halal on Purim? We say Halal on Hanukkah. Why don't we say Halal on Purim? One of the answers is, there's various answers. One of the answers is that Akati, that we're still Avde Dachashverish, and we're still servants of Achashverosh. Achashverosh let us be. The Rebbe used this. The Achashverosh to the Rebbe represented the kings of the nations in Golus. The Rebbe spoke in actually 1962. When the Rebbe turned 60, he made a very famous hadron on the Tractate of Pesach, and he spoke about how things are going to be in the end of the days. So one of the idea was, the Rebbe says over there, it talks about if Mashiach is going to come a natural way, or if it's going to come a beyond natural way. So the Rebbe says over there that we're not going to have to ask Achashverosh if Achashverosh agrees for us to build the third Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because Achashverosh lives on. The idea of Achashverosh lives on. So he says, but God gave, even though we were servants, but God doesn't leave us, and He gave us chesed to the kings of Paras, where things start to turn. Things start to turn when the story of Purim. For Ezra. They give us a place, a refuge. So we have to be thankful. So he starts the story of Esther from the perspective of, things could have been a lot different, right? The king Achashverosh, God made it so that although we were in Galus, the Rebbe always talked about Medina Shel Chesed. The Jewish people are still in Galus, but we have to be extremely thankful. Not all the times of our 2,000 years have it been good, but right now we're in a Medina Shel Chesed. I mean, Rav Bnei Yisrael live in a big majority of the Jewish people live in the United States of America is Medina Shel Chesed. So even if it's Melech Paras, but still, the idea is it's Chesed Lifnei Melech Paras. Okay. The Gra says something over here. The Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, says that the difference between Purim and Hanukkah, obviously, is that Purim is that's one of the answers. We don't say Hallel for a miracle that happened outside of Eretz Yisrael, but then the question is, Pesach happened outside of Eretz Yisrael. But the Hanukkah happened in Eretz Yisrael, and Purim happened outside of Eretz Yisrael. And the idea is that the chesed, that Melech Paras, it's a bigger deal when the miracle like Purim happens outside of Eretz Yisrael, because in Eretz Yisrael we have schusim, we have merits. So when we're in Eretz Yisrael, that the story of Hanukkah, we have merits, and also the Beis Hamikdash was still standing. But in Chutz La'aretz, we don't have merits, so it could have been different. But God gave us Chesed to Melech Paras. We have to be thankful. So again, that's from this last who was it? Reb Dimi Bar Yitzchak. The approach of Esther is to take into perspective where the story happened. Don't get over. Don't lose focus of the miracles that happened. It could have gone differently. Achashverosh could have. Who knows? Achashverosh, we see clearly, wasn't stable. He went here and went there. He was all over the place. All right, Reb Chanina bar Para, Pasach la Psicha la Pshasa mihacha. So Reb Chanina, the son of Papa, how did he start? He started off, Yikavnu enesh l'reishenu banu be'esh v'mayim. You caused man to ride over our heads, which is obviously negativity. We went through fire and through water. Be'esh, when did we go through fire? B'mei Nebuchadnezzar Rasha. The question is, what's the Eish? Eish could be talking about either the Hanan, Mishael, Varzai were thrown into the fire, but traditionally the Eish means the burning of the Beis Hamikdash. So we went through the fire for God, which was in the days that when will we punished with water? In the days of Paroi, when he threw the children in the Nile. But the pasuk continues, but you brought us out in abundance. That's in Bimei Haman, that's in days of Haman. So although we've suffered with fire, and those who say the destruction of the temple, but Rashi holds as Hanani, Mishael, Vazaria. And we were thrown into water, which is in the days of Paroi. but we were saved in the days of Haman. Rashi says, when will we be thrown in fire? We made Nebuchadnezzar, Shitlanu l'tocha kifshon. He put us into the kifshon eish, means he's referring obviously to Hananim Shal Vazariah. But others learn that it's talking about destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Steinzat says, is that Rav Steinzat who quoted it? I saw it. He says, the Maharsha explains that through fire is referring to the burning of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so Rav Steinzat is where I saw it. Where he quotes the Maharsha. Of course, you have to remember the Maharsha is one of the main primary commentaries on the Talmud. The great Maharsha. He lived in about 1500. He had a great yeshiva in Poland. So the Maharsha has the wonderful, what's called the Avodas of the Maharsha. The Maharsha is, if you read the Maharsha, very fascinating person about the life of the Maharsha. He was a wealthy person, but from his Avodas, from his commentary on Avodah, you see, he had a very deep love and appreciation for Klal Yisrael and for Torah, and he had a very interesting view of how he looked at things. So the Maharsha says that the temple by fire is the Nebuchadnezzar burning the temple, which would make most sense. So the Rashi says, seemingly throwing us into the furnace means Hananim Shal Vazariah. But it's all the same fire. The fire of the temple is the same fire of Hananim Shal Vazariah. And you brought us into the abundance is referring to Purim primarily because the miracle of Purim relates back to the banquet with abundance of wine, and Purim is celebrated through drinking of wine. So the Maharsha says that that the abundance, what's the abundance? The abundance is the celebration of Purim, but also the beginning of the story started with an abundance with the great meal. I'm not sure what he's talking about over here because he goes back and forth. It seems like there was a major censory on this part of the Gemara. Because it says in the Hebrew text, it says Nebuchadnezzar, but in the English translation, it's Vespasian, which is the Roman. They sent, in order to reflect the original version of the text, to avoid offending the Romans, the censor removed the phrase. So I'm not sure what phrase, what English he's talking about. In the days of Vespasian, the Roman emperor, and he placed it with the less evocative of Nebuchadnezzar. So in the times of the Talmud, the Jewish people weren't so concerned with Nebuchadnezzar, but they were more concerned with the Romans. Although actually in Rome itself, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was published in Babylonia. And it wasn't under the Romans, but later the censor was later affected in places that were under Rome or mainly under the church. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan started as follows: Zocher Chazdei v'Menaseh leVeis Yisrael, only talking the positive. He remembers his kindness and his faith to the Jewish people. Ro kol afsi aretz, and all the people of the world saw Yeshua Salakenu, the salvation God brought to the Jewish people. Emasai ro kol afsi aretz Yeshua Salakenu mei Mordechai v'Esther. When was the true sign of the salvation of the Jewish people in the days of Mordechai and Haman? Okay, when the Jewish people are successful, that's the Veroikal Amiyaretz is something, miracles that we've seen in our own times over the past few years. That we see the miracles that we see that's the Yeshua Hashem b'mei Mordechai v'Esther. Emasai ro kol afsi aretz Yeshua Salakenu b'mei Mordechai. Shadavar nigla l'chol umois shaholchu ageres b'chol olam. Rashi says, what does it mean the whole world saw? So today, the whole world saw is everyone's watching the news, but how did it literally work those days? Is because Mordechai and Esther sent letters at the end of the Megillah to all the Jewish communities, and all the nations saw that Mordechai and Esther empowered the Jewish people to defend themselves. Rish Lakish, who was the companion of Rabbi Yochanan, his brother-in-law, and also his Talmud, and also Rabbi Yochanan made Rish Lakish into a Baal Tshuva. He started the story of Megillah different. Again, a lot of times in the different approaches between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan is their past. Rabbi Yochanan was the head of the yeshiva. He was the one who put together the Jerusalem Talmud. He lived a very long time in Tveria. Rish Lakish was a bandit, a murderer. He was, I don't know, a murderer, but definitely a bandit that was Rabbi Yochanan brought him back to Yiddishkeit and married him off to his sister. At the end, Gemara tells us they fought a lot in study, but they also fought a lot. At the end, he gave him an evil eye. Rabbi Yochanan had the power of the evil eye. We find that a few times. But either way, they were very close. So Rish Lakish usually had different views. Rish Lakish looked at it from this perspective. Ari Noiheim, the lion, the roaring lion, the dove, Shokeg, and there's the hungry bear, Moishel Rasha al Amdol. So is a wicked ruler over the poor people. Ari Noiheim Zen Nebuchadnezzar. Rashi, we know that Nebuchadnezzar is Bar Ari. So the mazel of Nebuchadnezzar is the lion. I think some say, man, the Medrash says that he wrote on a lion, like that was his means of transportation to show the world his power. He rode on a lion and he had a leash of a snake. So Ari Noyim Zen Nebuchadnezzar Rasha, the Chsiv Bey Ola Aryeh Misuv Chai. So it's talking about Aryeh, which is Ola Aryeh, which is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Doiv Shoikik, the hungry bear or the restless bear, is Achashverosh. So the Babylonians were compared to lions. The Persians were compared to bears. The Chsiv Bey Va'aru Cheva Achari Sinyana Damya Ledov. As it says, behold another beast, and a second one like a bear. V'tani Rav Yosef Elu Parsim. Rav Yosef says, and Rav Yosef lived over there. He says, these are the Persians. Sha'oichlin v'shaisim kedaiv. They eat like a hungry bear. Umusubalim basar kedov. They're full of flesh like a bear. A bear is a fleshy animal. Umagadlim seir kedaiv. They hairy like a bear. Ve'en la'menucha kedaiv. And they're restless like the bear. So the Rav Yosef compared the Persians to the bears, and the bears are those who. That's the story of Achashverosh, which he was the Persian that in his time is the story of Purim. Rashi says, he says they're clothed with, they're very fat with meat. So that's the Persians. Okay, so Reb Steinzat says as follows. He says, Parsim, the Persians. Rav Yosef lived among the Persians. Okay, you have to remember something else. Even we know about the Babylonian, but there were different kings, right? There's the Romans primarily. This is why it's saying days of Mashiach. It's all come back. All the stories come back to life. So in the days of the destruction of the temple, we know that the Romans were never able to capture Persia. So those who are anxious about what's happening now in the Persian Gulf, this is an old problem. So the Romans were never able to capture Persia in all the wars. They had victories, but they didn't win the war. So Parsim, so Rabbi Yosef lived in the Persians. There's the Persians and the Babylonians. They're not exactly, it's Iraq and Iran. It's not exactly the same place. And therefore familiar not only with their unique customs with regard to eating and drinking, but also with their layers of flesh and long hair. So he knew them as personal. There's evidence that unlike the Babylonians, the Persians let their hair on their head grow long. Okay, I guess that you can see that in the pictures of Wikipedia. At times, even braided into their onto their heads. They had braids. The restlessness attributed here to the Persians may be indicative of their being horseback riders, and as their army was based largely on their horses, especially their swiftness and mobility, so they were just they're not restless. See, now today they're still restless. They can never just let everyone live. Just be quiet. Just live and let live. But they're restless. That's the nature of the bear, and that's the nature of the Persians. They never rest like the bear never rests. As opposed to some animals mentioned in the Gemara whose identification is questionable, it is clear that the animal referenced in the Gemara here is in fact the bear. Meaning, Reb Steinzal says sometimes we have Hebrew words that we translate, maybe a line or other things. Reb Steinzal was very into these things. He made sure that you should have exact translation of what is the animal that we're talking about. So if everyone's going to talk about one animal, Reb Steinzal is going to tell us we're talking about another animal. But he says in this case, it's safe to say we're actually talking about a bear. Although bears are heavy, as the Gemara here says, that they are coated with flesh, they are known to be restless and can run very quickly. Anyone who's watched the National Geographic, some bears, polar bears or grizzly bears, they move very fast. Consequently, they are said to never rest, and also they never rest. So therefore, that's the nature of the bear, and that's the nature of the Persian. Okay, so maybe we have to send this little piece of Gemara to Washington, so they'll have a little bit more understanding of what they're dealing with. All right, Moishel Rasha, a wicked ruler, Zehaman al Amdal Eli Yisrael, who's the poor nation, the Jewish people. But now the poor nation is not the way you think it's poor. It's not poor because we don't have any money or we're subjected to Achashverosh. Shem dalim mina mitzvahs. We don't have mitzvahs. We're not performing the mitzvahs the way we should. What defines a Jewish person's poverty is not money or not the situation, but how are you performing your mitzvahs? So because the Jewish people were dal from mitzvahs, they were poor of mitzvahs, therefore the Moishel Rasha, the wicked, is able to rule over them. Again, this is a classic case where it's not, seemingly you could say dalim, amdal is, unfortunate poor people that were weak, they were defenseless. No, if you would have done mitzvahs, you wouldn't have become subjugated to Haman's plans. Rabbi Lazar Psachla, Rabbi Lazar opened Psicha L'hai Pashas Miyacha. He started it with such a verse. He says that in Mishlei, Ba'atzaltayim Yimach HaMekora Ubeshiflus Yadam Yidloi Faboyis. What does this mean? He says that through laziness, the rafters, which is a mikora, is like a rafter on the ceiling, sink in, and through idleness, the hands of the house leaks. So what does this mean? The laziness of the Jewish people at the time, they didn't study Torah. This is a reference. The enemy of the Jewish people, meaning that God became mach is weak or poor. What's mach mean? Poverty. So we see clearly if a person is poor in his value. What's a rafter? So we see that in Tehillim 104 it says that also who lays the beams of his chambers in the waters. So that's also with reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that this is like God, that the Jewish people's laziness made God mach. We're going to have interesting commentaries on this in a second, because in the word mach we have missing two things. Interesting commentary. What does it mean that God became poor? He became poor, Rashi says, as if he couldn't help the Jewish people. Why couldn't he help the Jewish people? He didn't have any collateral. What is he supposed to help the Jewish people with? The Jewish people didn't do Torah mitzvahs. Because the Jewish people didn't do Torah mitzvahs, or Torah, he says, they were lazy in the study of Torah. It made God weak or poor. He couldn't help them. There's also, it says over here, very beautiful thing, that the word mach, he says, is says mach v'rosh. Rosh means poverty, and mach means poverty. If you take the words Eli, Aleph Lamed Yud, which is my Lord, and you add to the word mach, you have the name Michael. Who's Michael? Michael is Michael is the angel of positivity, that he's the one who is always advocating for the Jewish people. And see if I got this idea right. All right, mach. So mach is with the langa chaf, but if here it's with the chaf. So mach, you add in Eli to mach, you have Michael. So there's no, if the Jewish people don't study Torah, their advocate isn't there. Michael is the advocate. If you add Eli to Rosh, you have Yisrael. So the Jewish people were poor, Michael was poor. We're missing the Eli, you're missing God, you're missing Torah. So what does Esther say? What's Esther's tefillah? What's Esther's chapter that we attribute to the tefillah of Esther? Eli, Eli, lama zaftani. She says 2 times Eli. Add Eli back to Michael, add Eli back to Yisrael. Now we say, why did you forsake me? Help us. So if you add the Eli, and Kel is a sign of kindness and a strong of strength of Hashem, add the strength back to Michael, add the strength back to the Jewish people, and you have Yisrael and Michael, and God's not weak, and then you could have the Savior. That's why it was on behalf of Esther, on behalf of the Jewish people, she prayed, Eli, Eli, lama zaftani, chapter 22 of Tehillim. Okay, Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak Psachla, Pischa laha b'shas mihacha. Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak, he said like this, Shir HaMalais, it's the famous Shir HaMalais, Psalm 124, Lulei Hashem shahaya lanu yomer Yisrael, Lulei Hashem shahaya lanu bekum aleinu Adam. That we say, what is this? Is a praise that says, a song ascent of David, if not for the Lord who was with us, let Israel now say, if not for the Lord who was with us, when a man rose up against us. So that's how he translated, he entered the conversation of Esther. Why? Because Adam v'lei melech, we're lucky that Haman was a man and he wasn't a king. Had he been a king, it would be more difficult to deal with him. Adam v'lei melech is a Haman. Adam, a man and not a king, is Haman. So of course a lot of commentaries go into this idea, but again, of Leiv Melachim B'Yad Hashem, that the kings have another whole kind of relationship with God, in the positive and the negative. Others say that it's not Haman. It's brought down. The Iyayam says that it's talking about Achashverosh. Achashverosh wasn't a king. We're going to learn Achashverosh was muscled himself in. And that's why Vashti sent back that she says, Shomer Hasusim, my father's horse keepers, right? The guy who took care of the stables, he's going to tell me to get dressed up for his party. So she always belittled him. You were my father's, the Shomer Hasusim on Shalavi. You were the bar Achur, how does he, Harurei the Abba. The one who took care of the stables of my father, he's not going to tell me. He's not going to tell me what I should be doing. So that's also Adam is either Rashi says Adam is talking about Haman, but others say Adam is talking about Achashverosh himself. So he says several explanations are offered for the significance of the distinction between king and man. One idea is that because a king is concerned with the stability of his kingdom, he will usually be cautious and therefore restrain. Therefore, resistance to decimating a complete nation from within it. Haman, however, was a regular man and not a king. Therefore, he wasn't concerned with the threats to the throne and attempted to destroy all the Jewish people in the kingdom. So, although in the way the Or Chodesh is learning in it that Adam was worse because he was a person, so therefore Haman was just looking to destroy the Jewish people. Achashverosh again was a politician, and as a king, he would have been more concerned about the effects of destroying the Jewish people on his kingdom and his stability and the money. Whatever the Jewish people, of course, they offered plenty to the house of Achashverosh. He wasn't so keen on destroying the whole nation, the Jewish people, whereas Haman could care less. It wasn't about and he was just an irregular anti-Semite. He wasn't a king that was trying to benefit. Again, these things come up throughout our history that many times the Jewish people approached when they were going through difficult times in the Golas, they approached the king in a way that the king looked at it from a perspective of a monarch. And therefore, it wasn't always positive. That's what, of course, Abarbanel tried very hard to stop the decree of Isabella and Ferdinand. What was his name? That exiled the Jewish people from Spain. He tried to explain that it's not good. It's not
Ferdinand.
Ferdinand. Yeah.
Ferdinand.
So that it wasn't beneficial to the crown to exile the Jewish people, and it wasn't. Spain was never the same. Spain was never the same after the Jewish people left. I mean, the Barbanel was the finance minister. There was plenty of people there of importance in the kingdom of Spain. It wasn't the benefit, but he was so obsessed with his anti-Semitism and so influenced by his priests and bishops that he exiled the Jewish people, even though Spain never recovered from that. Ad hayom, and it shouldn't actually. Okay, hold on. Okay, others that say, okay, that's what the idea is. Either the Iyayam says it's Achashverosh himself, but most commentaries is talking about Haman. Why? Like Steinzal says, the Or Chodesh says, because Haman could care less about the benefit of the Jewish of the crown. He just was worried about. He just was concerned with his anti-Semitism. Rava started from over here. Rava says, okay, we can go a few more pieces. So when the righteous are on the increase, the people rejoice. But when the wicked man rules, the people mourn. Okay, that's a verse in Proverbs. So it's in Mishle. So it says, Esther. Everyone's happy, like it says, when they were victorious, everyone was happy. Like it says, the people cried. So the people cried. The city was mourning. That is referring to when Haman was in charge. He says over here. He says over here that okay, let's just go further. Rav Masna Omer Miachar Masna says from here, Kimi Goy Godel Asher Lo Elikim Kroivim Elav. Who's like the Jewish people? We just read this in Raschana, that God is close to them. Rav Ashi says he continues, V'oyanisa Elikim. So the one who if you tested God. So he says Rav Masna Omer Miachar Psach Psicha. He start from here. Steinzatz is going to explain what these verses mean. Again, so obviously the commentaries, the Talmud Megillah says that the idea is, of course, if God's close to the Jewish people, he's mamash a korev. So if God's close to the Jewish people as a close relative, of course, he's going to protect the Jewish people. And that's why we use this verse as a starting of the story of Haman, a story of Esther. And that's why it says also, it's brought down, that's why Haman said what he said, that if Achashverosh thinks that me Goy Gadol was like the Jewish people, the God's close to them. So Haman says that that the Jewish people are exiled amongst the nations. So if they're exiled amongst the nations, so they're not close to him anymore. So Rash Seinzat says, some explain this as homily as indicating that although the Jewish people are scattered and divided, they are still God's. They still have God near to them. So near to them, that says the Mashab, which is the idea that Haman tried to say that they were far, and God says, no, I'm close. Others explain that the focus of the statement is the conclusion of the same verse, as the Lord our God is wherever we call upon him, for this relates to the Jews' call to God and they were answered, as Sfas Emes says. So therefore, if we call to God because he's close to us, he's going to save us. Where's the story of Oya Nisa Lekim? The meaning of this is that the Purim redemption was similar to the redemption of Egypt. Who's like a God who took the Jewish people out? Which, subject to the verse, both were redemptions of a nation from amidst other nations. God went and took the Jewish people out of Egypt. In the sense of both redemptions involved reversal of fortune for the two nations involved. In Egypt, the body of water that had been the means to drown the Jewish babies became the means to drown the Egyptians in the splitting of the Red Sea. Similarly, in the case of Purim, the lots were cast to pick for a day of destruction of Israel. This day ended up becoming the day of Purim, which is the happiest day of the Jewish people. So this verse that says that God went out and he took the Jewish people out of another nation is the idea of God saving the Jewish people from other nations. So it says, we have a few more verses that go along this line. I think we're going to stop over here. And we'll finish off next week. We have Rav and Shmuel, and we have others, and then we're going to get into the actual story of Purim itself. Okay, so shakach everyone for joining on a summer night. Wish everyone well. Laila Tov and Kol Tuv. Take care. Thank you.